by Sheridan, who has an a Mr. Moses, who is a Jewish moneylender who is called an honest Jew, but it is nonetheless part of a way of talking about Jews that ought to shock us. Anti-Semitism was not a new thing when Sheridan wrote in the 18th century, nor did it go away. Some might argue it hasn't gone away just yet in England, or really anywhere else. But I wanted to give you the history of European anti-Semitism in brief so that you could understand how to read the characters and the references to Jewish moneylenders in this play and a larger understanding of anti-Semitism in Europe. The basic pattern of anti-Semitism in Europe goes a little like this. Before the fall of the Roman Empire, the Jews in Jerusalem were taken captive and brought back in chains to Rome for standing up to the Roman Empire. Jews had been, to a large extent, cosmopolitan, if marginal, citizens of the Roman Empire already. And then they were enslaved at the end of the Roman Empire as a captive people that had rebelled against Rome. What happens in the Middle Ages after the fall of Rome is that some Jews remain or return to the Middle East and North Africa. And with the rise of Islam, many Jews integrate into that society successfully, still as marginalized because they're never Muslim, but treated with the rights of other people within the caliphates. And those rights were more liberal than you might imagine for even people like women and religious minorities. Women, it could be argued, had more freedom under the Islamic caliphates, the real Islamic caliphates, not ISIS, to be very clear, that claims caliphate status, but they're really just a fascist state. They are not caliphates, as they were lived out, at least in the what's called the golden age of Islamic caliphates, about 1,000 years ago. But women could travel more and had more rights under those caliphates in 1000 AD than women currently have in Saudi Arabia, lift of ban on driving notwithstanding. And religious minorities were not usually persecuted. I mean, there were exceptions. There really were, for Christians and Jews and other peoples. However, Jews were able to participate in society meaningfully as sort of outsiders in a peripheral role who nevertheless had as many rights as many subjects. In Europe, though, it was quite a different story. Some Jews moved north during the Middle Ages and became marginalized. They were not allowed to live with Christians. They had to dress in many situations in a separate way so that the Christians could identify them as Jewish. They were forced to sometimes wear badges. Hitler's yellow star was not a completely original invention. And the discrimination they faced was very real and involved a great deal of oppression. They couldn't own land, but they were able to act in a manner as bankers because the Christian world did not have a banking system because of religious interdictions. It was thought to be immoral to charge interest, although some people did it on the DL. It was not considered all right to do. And that's why we see people who charge interest in, for instance, the Merchant of Venice, who are Jews, but it's okay to spit on Jews. It's okay to, in a fit of rage, burn down their villages. Um, there was no crime you couldn't accuse Jews of. The number of horrible stories that were told about Jews is shocking, like that they secretly knew that Jesus was Lord, but they really wanted to somehow subvert Christianity anyway. And so on Easter, they would kill Christian children and eat them. That was called the blood libel. There were also very bizarre theories about masculinity because it was known that Jews got circumcised. It was thought that men who were Jewish were somehow not really men, that they had their cut off by having circumcised penises in their tradition. And they were thought to menstruate. There was all kinds of craziness. And the Jews were kicked out of England specifically by the king for the following reason. And they were kicked out in the mid 13th century. The pattern of money lending was such that, let's say I am an English warlord. I own a castle and I see a rival next to me in a time particularly of unrest during the Middle Ages. And I want to fight that guy to take over his land and his castles. But I'm going to need money for catapults and soldiers and things like this. So I only have so many tapestries on hand I could sell, but I could go to a money lender in the Jewish community and could ask him for a bunch of money. I'll have to pay some interest, maybe a lot of interest, because it's a risky proposition. And if I win, I can actually afford to pay back the moneylender. But let's say I can't afford to pay back the moneylender because I lose, and I lose my lands. I still owe the money. And the Jewish money lending concern is asking for the right to get its money back. Well, if I'm a king and I borrow money, or a number of my lords borrow money as the king from people for similar war campaigns or just any number of things to keep up appearances, and I don't want to pay back the Jews, well, I can threaten them with violence. And when I tax the peasants to get the money to pay the lenders, that the peasants are going to get mad. But I can say, it's not me. It's those awful unchristian Jews that are the source of your troubles. And there's a very good chance that the peasants, rather than attack me with my standing army, will go attack the defenseless and unarmed Jewish village and indiscriminately kill absolutely everyone in it. That happened so many times, I can't even tell you in Europe. The term for that is pogrom. And it's something that was practiced for 1,000 years or more. Furthermore, if I'm king, I could actually kick out the Jews if I owe them way too much money that I can never pay back. And that way I never have to pay them back. So in a spirit of quote unquote piety, in the mid 1200s, the King of England kicks out all the Jews. Some hide and stay for a variety of reasons. Some convert. If you converted, you could stay, but you really wouldn't want anyone to know you were Jewish or ever. And others eventually return in the era of the Enlightenment. They are still discriminated against. They are still, the worst of them is believed. I mean, and stupid stuff. Like it was literally thought that Jewish men had horns on their head. In an era of scientific inquiry, some people thought that. I can't stress how stupid this is. And about the only profession open to Jewish men in this era where there was any significant interaction there were a few other exceptions. Occasionally, you call upon a Jewish doctor because they actually trained in a better tradition of medicine that knew more than a lot of Christian doctors did throughout most of European history since the fall of the Roman Empire. But mostly, you were a moneylender. If you had any interaction with uh, the Christian community, you were still not allowed to own land. You were still literally in a ghetto. That's where we get the term ghetto. That's what they called the place they forced the Jews to live in Venice when they let the Jews be part of the commercial enterprises of the Venetian Empire. And Jews therefore had to have professions where they lived by their wits. They could be schooled in law, they could be schooled in medicine, and you could steal every object they owned in a pogrom, but you couldn't steal their know-how with medicine or of things like education. As a result, Jews were often moneylenders. But the depiction in Sheridan's play, while not the most vicious in British theater, I refer you to some of the contemporaries of Shakespeare for the truly most vicious and propagandistic, evil Jewish characters in British theater who were thought evil only because they were Jewish and hence did all kinds of bad things. We have an honest Jew. I suppose that's progress, but it's a little odd that with a painting of his uncle looking at the man he supposes to be a Jew named Mr. Premium, our character Charles doesn't actually recognize any resemblance between the man in the painting, his cherished uncle, and the man he calls Mr. Premium. Just calling yourself Jewish is apparently enough to be a disguise where people can't see who you are if you're Christian. And I think that has to do with the fact that Jews were not perceived as fully part of the community ever during this time period in England. Jewish communities still feel embattled in Europe right now. Apparently, anti-Semitism is very much on the rise in a number of places. I note particularly France that has in its news a large number of stories of anti-Semitic attacks that ought to give us pause and make us feel very sad and angry, I think. So we see in Sheridan a part of a larger pattern of dehumanizing Jews, although he is more polite about it. The next work we read in this section of the course is by not a play about a Black man, but a true life account, a memoir by a man of color who had been a slave and managed to purchase himself out of slavery, Olata Equiano. And here we have, because it is truly his own voice, an authentic account of how he understands things at this same time. It's interesting to note that there were multiple kinds of prejudice in Europe at this time against people who looked differently, worshiped differently. And there were certainly class prejudices. It was thought that the working class was incapable of understanding the upper classes, and they literally called people who were of a higher aristocratic class their betters. Their betters. And so this is a stratified and rigid class system. In understanding this, I believe we understand the American Revolution better. And as Americans, I suppose that's incredibly useful to us. I wanted to give you just this quick word so you could have a sense of how to read that portion of the play. I would never